Hi there. I'd like to welcome you all to the Zoom Symposium, Oral Tradition from West Africa and the Balkans to Florida. I'd like to thank all our attendees and our symposiasts, Professors David Elmer, Joseph Hellweg, and Panayotis League. I'd also like to thank the Winthrop-King Institute for Contemporary French and Francophone Studies for their support, initially through the lecture series of Florida State University's Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics lecture series, and beyond that to the heavy listing of logistical and promotional support. In particular, I'd like to thank Rasha Satati and David Sale for their generosity, for sharing their time and their experience. I'm also grateful to my colleagues Martin Monroe and Christian Weber for helping to move this symposium forward at various crucial moments. As John Miles Foley remarked in his 2002 How to Read an Oral Poem, writing has appeared only very lately in the ongoing history of Homo sapiens. Like it or not, for most of our existence as a species, cultural literacy didn't involve literacy. If writing is recent and written literature is rare, Foley again, all peoples have composed and transmitted oral traditions as an alternative verbal technology that has shown itself not only more widespread than texts, but also more adaptable and durable. Of course, we owe a great deal to the theories, fieldwork, and findings of the scholars of Homeric and South Slavic epic and the founders of today's field of oral tradition, Millman Perry and Albert B. Lord. I'm quite sure that their names will occur frequently in today's presentations and discussions. Today, of course, everybody's interested more than ever in the personalities behind great discoveries. And in fact, Robert Canigal's new biography of Perry, Reading Homer's Song, The Brief Life and Big Idea of Millman Perry, is being released by Penguin Random House at the end of this month. Now, two of the richest traditions of the oral performance and transmission of songs of heroes, epic and praise song, are found in West Africa, in particular Côte d'Ivoire, and the European Balkans, the mountainous region from Bosnia in the west, where Perry tested his theory of oral composition, to Greece in the south. Today's symposium will explore these traditions and their historical, political, scholarly, and performance contexts through talks from Professors Elmer, Hellweg, and League, three leading figures in the field. As we proceed, I'd like to request of the attendees that you not use the chat function for your questions. Please type your questions into the Q&A box, and please address them to specific panels or to the whole group. At the end of our discussion, I'll be able to sort them and I will address them to the panelists. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first symposiast, David F. Elmer. David Elmer is Elliott Professor of Greek Literature in the Department of the Classics at Harvard University and curator of the Millman Perry Collection of Oral Literature at Harvard's Widener Library. He is author of the monograph, The Poetics of Consent, Collective Decision-Making and the Iliad, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, 2013, and of numerous articles and book chapters. He's the editor of the third edition of Albert Lord's The Singer of Tales, published in 2019. And he's also editor of the journal Oral Tradition, founded by John Miles Foley. Professor Elmer's research interests are the Homeric poems, the ancient novel, and South Slavic oral epic song, especially that of Bosnia. Since the pioneering work of Perry and Lord, the first and third areas, the Homeric poems and South Slavic oral epic, are never entirely separate. And in this tradition, Professor Elmer frequently discusses the impact on our thinking about Homer's art in his research on South Slavic epic. What is more, Professor Elmer's work follows the expansion of the field from Perry and Lord's philology into the areas of performance and musicology, a direction pioneered by his mentor, John M. Foley. More recently, he has been thinking and writing about how South Slavic oral epic eludes projects of national definition and demarcation, as well as theorizations of a difference between orality and literacy. All of these discourses have, of course, been imposed on this material. So Professor Elmer's presentation is titled South Slavic Epic and the Philology of the Border. Professor Elmer.
Thanks very much, Professor Romanchuk. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for the generous introduction. I am indeed mostly a scholar of ancient Greek literature, but I have had the pleasure of working and writing about South Slavic oral traditions in a number of different contexts over the years. What I'm presenting today is something of a new way of framing this material for me, so it's a pleasure to present this for you. And I'd also appreciate your patience if some of the things I present here seem as though they still need to be more fully worked out. I've prepared a short bibliography that has references to some of the texts I'll mention. That's a Google Doc, and I'm going to paste the link into the chat box right now where I think everybody should be able to see it, so you can go there and get the bibliography if you want. And at this point, I'm going to start my slideshow. And I will get things started just by trying to situate a little bit the traditions I'll be referring to today. So oral epic song has been documented among all the South Slavic national groups, from the Slovenes in the west to the Bulgarians in the east. And it's also been documented among neighboring non-Slavic groups, the Romanians in the north and Albanians in the south. Among the South Slavs in particular, the richest tradition developed in the central zone of the Dinaric Alps. If you look on this map, the area I'm talking about is basically this dark orange to brown color here that extends from the border between Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina through southern Bosnia over to Montenegro and southern Serbia. Now, this geographical region is historically significant because for centuries it lay on the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire. And this map shows you the western end of the empire in the late 18th century. You can kind of ignore these white lines here. But as you see, the region I'm talking about basically extends from the frontier here between the Ottomans and the Habsburg Empire, and then along the frontier with the Venetian territories along the Adriatic. So we're talking about an epic tradition that originated in this kind of border zone and is in many ways really shaped by the experiences of those living in that zone. Experiences that included constant skirmishing, pillaging, migrations of populations back and forth across the border. The richest part of the South Slavic epic traditions, arguably, is a tradition that's sometimes called the Krajinska epika, or the Epic of Krajina. And that toponym Krajina really just means the borderland and refers to precisely this frontier zone. There's a wonderful monograph on the aesthetics of this tradition by Alois Schmaus. You'll find that on my bibliography. The typical plots of this tradition often feature acts of border crossing, so captives returning from captivity abroad, brides being abducted from the other side of the frontier, and so on. And I think the tradition can really be very fruitfully framed within the very rich body of scholarship that's developed over the last several decades on the cultures of borderlands. So this is a really, as I say, rich body of scholarship, much of it inspired by the beautiful book of Gloria Ansaldúa, Borderlands. It's a body of scholarship that views borders not as lines of demarcation, but instead as zones of contact and intermingling, where cultural oppositions are constructed, but also internalized, reflected upon, complicated, and ultimately deconstructed. The tradition I'm talking about, these South Slavic epic traditions, certainly exhibit many signs of the kinds of contact and intermingling that borderland theory highlights. And we can take as an example the many convergences between South Slavic epic and the neighboring Albanian epic tradition. Convergences that begin with very similar performance styles and the use of similar instruments. So the Slavs typically accompany their epics with an instrument that they call gusle, and the Albanians an instrument that they call lahuta, but it's really just the same instrument. There are other convergences as well. These traditions share many identical plots. They share overlapping casts of characters. They have converging metrical schemes. So among the Slavs, there's a fairly rigid decasyllabic or 10-syllable metrical scheme for the verse. It's a bit more flexible among the Albanians, but it also tends towards a decasyllabic pattern. And even though the epics in these traditions are sung in different languages, they actually share a certain kind of particularly important epic lexicon of Turkish loanwords, borrowings from Turkish, that refer to typical elements of the heroic world. These include weapons, items of dress, horses, pieces of equipment for horses, and so on. So there's a lot of convergences between these traditions. And it's important to remember that the convergences reflect the actual movement of real people, of tradition bearers across borders and between communities. So when Millman Perry was working on epics of the region in the 1930s, he found, in fact, many interesting cases of bilingual singers, like the singer shown here, Salih Ugljanin, who could sing epics in both Bosnian, as he called it, and Albanian, and even translate texts from one language to another. And there's an important book on this phenomenon by John Kolsty, published in 1990. So all this is to say that the South Slavic epic tradition is a typical example of the culture of a borderland, exhibiting all the kinds of intermingling and blurring of boundaries that we would expect. At the same time, and maybe in fact precisely because of that, that reason, borders of various kinds have over the centuries and decades been mapped onto this tradition. And some of these are national borders. So this is especially obvious when we deal with the Muslim traditions of Bosnia, which at various times and by various individuals have been described as Serbian traditions, as Croatian traditions, and sometimes as distinctively Bosnian traditions. And as you would expect, there's almost always a political motivation for the application or choice of one or the other of those labels. So some of the borders that have been imposed on the traditions of this region, as I say, have national significance, and some are borders of other kinds. And the one that I'll be focusing on in a few minutes is the border between orality and literacy, or the cultures of orality and literacy. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is to kind of take a few examples of these strategies of demarcation and talk about how the material itself responds to the borders imposed. I'm going to suggest that what I'm doing is practicing something that I will call, with a bit, maybe a touch of grandiosity, a philology of the border. And I want to unpack that term for just a moment. Philology, historically, is a linguistically grounded method for the study of written texts. And as a modern methodology, it's very closely tied to the practice of textual criticism, which is the study of manuscripts and manuscript traditions. It's the method by which the readings of manuscripts, the words that we find there, are scrutinized and judged to be either, I'm sorry for my phone ringing, judged to be either authentic, that is the words of the author, him or herself, or spurious, the product of error or contamination in the manuscript tradition. So philology in this sense is a method for separating true from false readings, or a method, we might say, for drawing a border or a boundary between them. Now, when I talk about the philology of the border, I mean a philology that is very self-consciously recursive, in the sense that it takes as one object of examination the very act of discrimination itself. This is going to be a philology that attends simultaneously to the dynamics of both inclusion and exclusion that are embodied to an extent in every text. So that gives you a little bit about my approach. Now, in seeking to apply this approach, I'm going to begin with a man named Vuk Stafanovic Karadžić, a very important figure in the development in fact, the development of Serbia as a modern nation state. Vuk really laid the groundwork for the collection and study of oral traditions among the South Slavs. He was not the first to collect those traditions, but he was the first to really bring those traditions to widespread international attention. And his interest in the oral traditions of the region were part of a larger project, a project that also involved important work in language standardization and orthography. This was a nationalist project, a project aimed at defining the Serbian nation in a linguistic and cultural perspective, and a project very much conceived in terms of the romantic nationalism of Johann Gottfried von Herder. Now, like Herder, Karadžić, or Vuk as he's commonly referred to, believed that the purest expression of the people could be found in the oral traditions of the peasant class, and especially in Vuk's case, in oral epic poetry. So as a first step in his program, he published a little book, quite literally, a little Slaveno-Serbian songbook of the common people, published in 1814. This was a small collection of lyric and epic songs that immediately caught the attention of European intellectuals interested in Slavic nation building. And the songs that were included in this volume were quite obviously chosen, selected to frame a picture of Serbian national identity. This is particularly clear in the second portion of the book, which contains epic songs. The first epic is about a hero named Miloš Obilić, who is the hero who is said to have killed the Turkish Sultan at the Battle of Kosovo, this kind of foundational moment in Serbian national consciousness. The second song is about Marko Kraljević, the most prominent figure in Serbian heroic folklore, and so on. Things get a little more interesting when we get to the end of this book. The second to last song in the book, and the second to last song in the epic section, is one that has come to be known as the Hasanaginitsa, or the sorrowful song of the noble wife of Hasanaga, which Vuk attributes to Serbs of the Muslim faith. Now, this is a song that describes the death of the wife of a Turkish nobleman, and it was originally collected not by Vuk himself, but by a Venetian clergyman named Alberto Fortius in Dalmatia towards the end of the 18th century. And Fortius published the text both in the original language and in Italian in 1774. By Vuk's time, this song was already really quite famous. Actually, a German translation by Goethe was printed in Herder's Volkslieder of 1778. And in fact, by 1814, when Vuk publishes his volume, this song has been translated into a number of other European languages as well. So it's already, by Vuk's time, part of world literature, we might say, and was circulating internationally as a symbol of South Slavic identity. And this is undoubtedly exactly why Vuk brings it into his collection. From the perspective of what I'm calling the philology of the border, what is most interesting about this text is the fact that the identity it encodes is so difficult to pin down, even fluid, because it depends on where and how the text circulates. The song would seem to originate in an Islamic milieu, but it was evidently, when Fortius found it, circulating among the Christian populations of the Dalmatian hinterland, likely brought there by migrants from Ottoman territory. Vuk presents it as a symbol of Serbian identity. For Fortius, it's a symbol of the identity of the Morlocks, the Slavs of the Dalmatian hinterland. As I say, Fortius probably collected the song from a Christian informant, and from the point of view of that informant, the song most likely represented or stood for the Turks who lived on the other side of the Ottoman frontier. So from my perspective, the question that emerges is, to whom exactly does this song belong, or for whom does it speak? And the answer really is, it depends. It depends on where and how it's circulating. Now, the Hasanaginitsa actually upsets Vuk's classificatory schemes in one other way as well, and I'd like to talk for a moment about that. The songbook is divided into two sections, which Vuk labels women's songs, that's the first section, and men's songs, that's the second section, with the Hasanaginitsa appearing among the men's songs. This binary division becomes one of the most fundamental and firmly rooted ways of categorizing South Slavic oral poetry. And to my knowledge, it appears here really for the first time. The basic idea is that the category of men's songs, which, by the way, Vuk in later writings renames heroic songs, junačke pjesme, that category includes epic style songs, songs in the decasyllabic verse that can in principle be sung to the gusle. And the category of women's songs includes basically everything else, regardless, in fact, of whether the songs are sung by women or by men. Now, this distinction, as I mentioned, is one of the most fundamental lines of demarcation within the tradition. And in a sense, it's a border that constitutes the genre of epic, which is in a way defined by this process of excluding everything that doesn't belong to the epic genre. Vuk himself was actually aware that there are many songs that lie, as he put it, on the boundary between the two categories, and he has an interesting discussion of this in the introduction to volume 1 of his 1823 collection of folk songs. The Hasanaginitsa isn't in that 1823 collection, but actually it would be a great example of a song lying on the boundary, as Vuk puts it, because while it is decasyllabic and looks in many ways like an epic song, actually in terms of its thematics, its focus on a domestic tragedy, the death of a married woman, it's much closer to what we know about the repertoires of female singers in Dalmatia in this time and place. Furthermore, Vuk himself knew that there were, in fact, plenty of women who could and did sing epic songs to the gusle. So all that is to say that Vuk in various ways acknowledges that his system doesn't correspond completely to ethnographic realities. And I think that's a good indication that what we're dealing with really is much more an ideological expression of something we might call gender politics than it is a proper ethnographic description. And in this regard, I find very interesting the shift in terminology from men's songs to heroic songs, a shift that kind of collapses together notions of Serbian masculinity and Serbian heroism, something that I think is very important in the context of the Serbian struggle for national independence in the early 19th century. There's a great discussion of some of the problematics here by Ivan Enic, which you will find on my bibliography. So at this point, and I'm very conscious of the time, I'm going to leave behind the 19th century and the age of nationalism and move into the 20th century and turn to a person who has already been mentioned, Millman Perry, an American Homerist, who was responsible more than anyone else for really shifting the way we think about Homeric poetry. Already in his doctoral dissertation, he had theorized that the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed using a technique of oral composition and performance that relied on formulas, on poetic expressions ready-made to fit together in lines of verse. And this is what has come to be known as the oral formulaic theory. And even as he was finishing his doctoral work, he'd figured out that he would have to test his theories by empirical observation. And so between 1933 and 1935, the year of his death, he spent some 18 months documenting oral epic traditions in what was then the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And what he observed there was a tradition that worked just as his theory predicted. He found singers that used a rich system of recurring traditional phrases to compose and recompose their songs as they performed them. They didn't memorize texts, but told the story anew each time with varying wording by relying on a stock of formulas. Now, Perry died before he could really synthesize all the results of his field work. But in a late writing, he actually lays out the goals and purposes behind his collection. And I won't read this whole quote, but the basic point here is that what he was looking for, what he was hoping to discover, were principles that would allow him to distinguish texts that had been composed orally from texts that had been composed in writing. So he's really trying to map the boundary between orality and literacy in this fieldwork project. And the key for him was, again, composition by formula. Now, his work was carried on by his student, Albert Lord, who's also been mentioned in the introduction. And Lord's 1960 book, The Singer of Tales, really was the definitive formulation of the oral formulaic theory. Here, Lord insisted on an absolute divide between oral and written composition, and he argued that the density or frequency of formulas in any given text could be reliably used to determine whether the text was orally composed or composed in writing. He also denied the possibility of what was called a transitional text, that is, a text that somehow combined elements of oral composition and composition in writing. And in denying that, he was responding to scholars who had applied this notion of the transitional text to early poems like the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf. And this was a very attractive notion for many scholars because it allowed them to acknowledge the presence of oral features while also preserving the notion of the genius poet laboring over his text with pen in hand. But Lord denied this as a possibility. Now, as Lord's work progressed and the work of others progressed, it became clearer and clearer over time that the boundary that Lord had insisted upon was really not as rigid as he had suggested. So in the first place, it became clearer and clearer that formulaic density or frequency was a far less reliable criterion than Perry or Lord had suspected. There are, in fact, undeniably written texts that employ formulas, and conversely, undeniably oral texts that do not rely on this kind of technique of formulaic composition. And by the same token, Lord eventually came to recognize the possibility of transitional texts in a certain restricted sense. He has a beautiful essay on what he understands by transitional text that was published posthumously a couple of years after his death in the book, The Singer Resumes the Tale. So the important point here is that from the standpoint of current scholarship, the border between oral and written poetry is more permeable, and the means for establishing it less reliable than Perry and Lord realized at the outset of their research. Now, that said, arguably that same border has reappeared in a different guise more recently in the form of a distinction between traditional and so-called post-traditional singers. This is a distinction that was put forward for South Slavic epic some 10 or 15 years ago by a prominent scholar of Bosnian poetry, Zlatan Čolaković, who argued that Perry's best singer, Avdo Medjedovic, was not in fact representative of his tradition, but was rather a uniquely creative artist who had broken with his tradition to produce something non-traditional. He was what Cholakovich called a post-traditional singer. And this distinction has been taken up with enthusiasm by certain Homerists, much like the notion of the transitional text that Lord was arguing against. This distinction has been taken up with enthusiasm by some Homerists who would like to use Perry's analogy with South Slavic epic not to demonstrate the traditional elements of Homeric poetry, which was Perry's goal, but to demonstrate instead the artistic singularity of the Homeric poems. Now, without question, Medjedovic was an exceptional singer. He produced texts for Perry and Lord that were 3 to 4 times as long as typical songs in his tradition. He had a far richer descriptive technique than other singers. He displayed a fairly remarkable willingness to alter the material that he learned from others. But none of this should obscure the fact that the distinction between traditional and post-traditional singers is, I would say, really just as ideological and just as divorced from ethnographic realities as the distinction between women's songs and heroic songs. This is a distinction that rests on the easily falsifiable assumption that traditional artists are merely reproductive, and a distinction that in a very kind of elitist way reserves creativity for a select few while making the vast majority of tradition bearers just reproductive craftsmen or craftswomen. But Medjedovic's art was really plainly traditional. He had simply mastered it more fully than most of his peers. Indeed, he would not have been able, we can say this with confidence, he would not have been able to compose the 12,000 line songs or 13,000 line songs that he composed for Perry if he were not relying on a traditional technique of composition and performance. So if we examine his oeuvre from the perspective of the philology of the border, what we see is that Medjedovic was indeed exceptional in a number of ways and pushed the limits of his art, but not to the extent that he, so to speak, crossed over into a territory that lies beyond tradition. So I'm very conscious of the time. I think I've reached the limit, my own boundary. And I will stop there, but I welcome any comments when we have the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. We'll go through all the questions that people are typing at the very end of the program. So please keep asking questions. I will be keeping track of them, and I will read them to the presenters at the end of our program. All right, at this point, I would like to introduce Professor Joseph Hellweg. Joseph Hellweg is Associate Professor of Religion in the Department of Religion at Florida State University. He's author of the monograph Hunting the Ethical State, the Ben-Kari Movement of Côte d'Ivoire, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2001, and also the textbook Anthropologie, les premiers pas, published by L'Harmattan in Paris 2011, as well as many shorter publications. He is the past president of the Mandé Studies Association and has served as an expert witness in numerous asylum cases for political refugees from Côte d'Ivoire. Professor Hellweg is a cultural anthropologist with interest in religion, Islam, politics, performance, and health in West Africa, that is Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, and Mali, where he's done over 5 years of field work. He's currently preparing a new book manuscript titled Practical Religion, Hunting Islam and the Poetics of Action in the Songs of Drummond Coulibaly. It examines the praise songs and heroic epics sung by Dozo Hunters in Côte d'Ivoire. These songs are a witness to a flexible religious ideology that straddles Islam, local hunting rights, and the contemporary national politics of Côte d'Ivoire. The songs of Professor Hellweg's Dozo host, Drummond form the core of his new book project. Professor Hellweg's presentation today is titled Immorality, with a slash, Dozo songs as multimodal interreligious performance in Northwestern Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, great, thanks. And thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Robert, for organizing this. Thank you to Rasha and Winthrop-King as well for doing so. It's a pleasure to be here and also to join and to meet David and Panayotis. David, thank you too for the bibliography you provided. If anybody is interested in the sources behind what I'll talk about, I'd be happy to provide such a document as well. I hadn't thought of that. And I really love this concept of the philology of the border. And I think in a sense, that's what I'm talking about, although in this case, the border between textual Islam and a certain kind of reformist Islam and indigenous ritual practice focused on hunting in West Africa. And today I want to talk about the notion of orality itself, which comes from the Latin, of course, or os for mouth, derived from the Sanskrit as. And when I speak, I'm engaged in an oral phenomenon. Words are coming out of my mouth, but we've come to equate that term orality, I think, with, in a sense, disembodied words, unrecorded, without a physical grounding or some sort of material correlate that words have in writing. And we often fail to theorize those connections. And worse, the word has come to mean just unwritten in any sense, or uninscribed. And historically, it's a word associated with non-literate or colonized peoples. And for some, oh, there we go. And tends to characterize a space that anthropologist Michel Roth-Trouillot has called the savage slot, wherein orality becomes part of a series of other oppositions, in contrast to literacy associated with civilization, rationality, science, former colonizers, urbanity, and world religions, whereas orality is associated with, hopefully nobody would use this term anymore, of course, but the primitive, the irrational, the unempirical, peoples who were colonized, rurality, and quote unquote tribal, or what we would call today, hopefully, indigenous religions. So literacy has become a distinctive feature in this scenario of an ideology of cultural superiority, with orality as a kind of consolation prize that scholars discover and vindicate and define. These peoples may not have writing, but look, they have orality, and here is the contribution that orality can make to understanding cultural diversity. Where I work in West Africa, in the Manding speaking part of the sub-region in northwestern Côte d'Ivoire, but also in adjoining Guinea and Mali, the only analogous term I can think of to orality is kuma, which simply means word, not orality. So I conclude that our notion of orality is in fact a cultural import, a kind of imposed notion, out of sorts with the way my hosts in West Africa think about their verbal production. Now, it could be that I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. Certainly, we all speak at times with no reference at all to writing. We can distinguish purely oral forms of verbal production from written ones. Or can we? Who among us can say that writing has had no impact on our speech? Now, maybe that's different for non-literate cultures, of course, but which among them have had no interaction with people who write, or who have heard no stories from or about writing, at least for the past century or more? These are the very sorts of questions that Ruth Finnegan asked in her 2007 book, The Oral and Beyond. For Finnegan, even unwritten verbal production in Africa or elsewhere is far from being purely oral. She has a hard time imagining any oral tradition, in fact, that lacks contact with literacy of some sort, or that goes uninscribed in some kind of material, embodied, performative, or emplaced way. Rather than make any hard and fast distinctions between orality and literacy, she refers to the multimodal or multimodality. According to Finnegan, multimodality relies on, quote, sonic patternings, visual gestures, facial expressions, interactions with audience, and in many cases, singing, as we've just heard, and sometimes dance or dance-evoking movements, in addition to spoken words, end quote. Writing for Finnegan, then, is just another mode of communication among many, lying along a vast continuum of embodied and material manifestations that verbal creativity can take. And for the rest of my remarks, I want to return to this area centered on the provisional capital of Ojene, Northwestern Côte d'Ivoire, to talk about the songs of Dozo Hunters there. I want to argue that their songs illustrate well Finnegan's point about multimodality. I'll also draw on Richard Bauman and Charles Briggs' idea of intextualization to show how Dozo Hunters use songs to create a multimodal space between the Islam that they all practice as Muslims and their own hunting practices that center more on African indigenous ritual concerns. In other words, what I fear is that if we overlook this multimodal realm in the domain of verbal art, then we're also going to overlook the source of a kind of West African religious genius. In the Manding languages in which I work, the word for song, dongiri, literally means call to dance. Dong means dance and kiri means to call. By implication, a singer intends his words, these singers are men, to inspire others to move, to embody the singer's words and music. And let me just say a bit about these hunters that I work with. In fact, the word dozo doesn't mean hunter. The word in Wojene Kakam, the version of Manding that is spoken in this area, means to enter the village. So these are men who, because of their hunting, repeatedly leave their villages and come back in. They gather knowledge of medicinal plants, so they're healers. They claim to be able to talk to animals through certain practices of sorcery to protect themselves from animals' own sorcery as well. They claim to encounter human sorcerers who shapeshift into aggressive animals in the forest, and so on. As opposed to just a regular hunter, any boy or man who picks up a gun, or occasionally a woman who will go to hunt in the forest. The word for that in Manding is Soro, which literally means a killer of game. So Dozo Hunters are actually experts in a congeries of forms of expertise. In the 1990s, they drew upon the national reach of the ritual networks I'll talk about shortly. Every dozo undergoes a ritual initiation. They have these initiations across the country because of migration, and so their networks spanned all of Côte d'Ivoire. And because police were so corrupt and inefficient in the 1990s, at the time I was doing my field work, dozos, as armed, very well-disciplined men, formed networks of unofficial security agents. You can see they have, they're wearing, this one is wearing an identity card that were issued by the municipal authorities to give them some sort of meta state authorization for their anti-crime work. And then from 2000 to 2007, they joined an armed rebellion to overthrow the Islamophobic anti-Manding regime of then President Laurent Gbagbo. And they claimed at the time to draw on their incantations and sorcery to make themselves invulnerable to bullets. So they have a rather diverse a range of activities. My host in Northwestern Côte d'Ivoire, Drummond Coulibaly, was, until his retirement several years ago, the most important Dozo singer or Ngonu Fola in the region, perhaps in all of Côte d'Ivoire. He regularly sang at Dozo funerals, where I attended and recorded his songs. As Drummond sang, other Dozo musicians accompanied him on the Dozo's harp, which you see right here. Dozos refer to it as the ngonu. It's a calabash-shaped instrument. You can see the gourd at the base with 6 strings arranged in 2 parallel lines that run up that arm that is anchored at the base of that gourd and are anchored on the other end at the top of that arm. Dozo musicians play those 2 rows of strings made of fishing line with their thumb and forefinger. Many musicologists think that this is the ancestor of the banjo, and in fact, Dozos will hold it across and sort of diagonal across the front of their bodies, like the apprentice to the singer on the left of the screen. The main singer is at the center, is holding the harp. At Dozo funerals, singers like Drummond sing to provoke other Dozos to hunt, to calm the spirit of the dead Dozo. And the word for this spirit is Ya, means shadow. It's kind of double, that hangs around among the living. And unless living Dozos show that spirit some respect through singing, dancing, by going out into the forest to kill game for that man's family at night, that Ya, that shadow, that double, will spoil the family's crops, make their livestock ill, and potentially ruin the hunt for all hunters, Dozo and non-Dozo alike. So the singer's apprentices, like those to the left and right of the singer in the center here, would accompany Drummond at these funeral events in nighttime. And women in the audience who would sing Drummond and his apprentices' refrains. By challenging Dozo hunters to hunt, these singers attempted to enact the moral relationship that affines Dozo identity and the Dozo role. Dozos have an obligation to hunt for non-Dozos. And on that night of the funeral, for the women and non-Dozos and the deceased Dozo's family. Hunting per se then doesn't define Dozos. Their willingness to hunt for others defines them. One night, Drummond, pictured here, told me in his family compound, he said, all hunters are not the same. Some are real, others just own guns. Dozo biete kelinye, dozo yiri yiri, doye morifatigiye. If you do well on an exam, he continued, that's good. You're happy, your father's happy. When I sing, he said, Dozos are happy. Lekolenka nikase examen na akani isawani ifache sawani. Ninka dongiri da dozo sawani. There are lots of students, he said, they don't all do well on exams. Lots of men own guns, not all are hunters. He spoke this way, syllogistically. You become a real student by taking exams, he said. It gives you courage. It pleases you. You become a real hunter by listening to songs. Nika dongiri lame, ibeke dozo yere yere. So for Drummond, songs played as determining a role in Dozo's lives as hunting did. Textuality was central to hunting, not an afterthought. So too was Islam. Drummond often sang in his songs that his harp, the ngonu, was, I quote, the Dozo's Quran, ngonuye dozo Quranai. He also said, quote, that he put his hand in the Dozo's Quran, dozo Quranaro, when he sang. When his apprentices plucked the ngonu's strings, they turned the pages of a book, as it were. Drummond called the ngonu his harp a kitabu, from the Arabic kitab, meaning book. In Arabic, the Quran is the book, al-Kitab or Kitabullah, the book of God. For Dozos, Drummond's songs were a book of God too, one that challenged the idea that writing in Arabic was somehow superior to Dozo lore in revealing God's will. Here, as Finnegan has, Drummond seemed to challenge any hard and fast boundary between orality and literacy. I want to say some more about the ritual background, the sort of hunter's cosmos that stands parallel to official Islam in their lives. According to Drummond, Mori, the first Dozo hunter, to whom Dozos make their ritual sacrifices, as in this ritual area near Ojene in northwestern Côte d'Ivoire, Mori is the person to whom Dozos will sacrifice a red chicken and 10 red kola nuts to be initiated as a Dozo. Drummond and other Dozos I spoke with claimed that this figure, Mori, descended from Nabi Abraham, through Ishmael and Esau, a character they call Nabi Enzu, putting him in Islam's prophetic line. Now, this is a figure, Nabi Enzu, Esau, a figure from the book of Genesis, Hebraic Judeo-Christian scripture, does not appear in the Quran. And somehow, I believe through local imams, Dozos came to know about this figure. And they trace Mori then through Esau back to Ibrahim, putting him squarely within the realm of Islam. Drummond argued then, in effect, that stories of Mori leave material traces in his harp, just as God's stories of other prophets, Muslim prophets, lie in the pages of the Quran. Now, reformist Muslims, Salafi or Wahhabi Muslims, who take their critical approach to Islam from the 18th century reformer Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, condemn Dozo's reverence for Mori and the sacrifices that they make to him for their initiations and also for his protection in the forest when they hunt, because reformist Muslims consider these sacrifices shirk or apostasy, giving recognition to a human spirit, the recognition they should be giving to God, and depending in some way on that spirit for protection in the forest, the way they should be completely dependent upon Allah. Drummond challenged this condemnation and its very basis, the supposed authority of written text in Arabic over so-called oral Manding ones, his own Dozo songs. In West Africa and elsewhere in the Muslim world, the Quran, of course, is recited as much as read. It has both oral and corporeal elements, just as Drummond's songs do. Drummond thus placed orality and literacy on a continuum, in part to clarify potential ambiguities in Dozo's Muslim status. I heard Drummond say that night, and I'm sorry that that screen sharing line is blocking the name of Charles Briggs and part of the name of Richard Bauman, but I heard Drummond say that in his songs then, when he identified his harp as the Dozo's Quran, that his songs are a form or were a form of what Richard Bauman and Charles Briggs call intextualization. To quote, the process of rendering discourse extractable, of making a stretch of linguistic production into a unit, a text that can be lifted out of its interactional setting. A text from this vantage point is discourse rendered decontextualizable, end quote. Dozo songs achieve just this end, I want to argue. It, again, to quote Bauman and Briggs, they put the act of speaking on display. They objectify it, lift it to a degree from its interactional setting, and open it to scrutiny by an audience. Performance heightens awareness of the act of speaking and licenses the audience to evaluate the skill and effectiveness of the performer's accomplishment. By its very nature, then, performance potentiates decontextualization, end quote. These, I want to argue, were Drummond's objectives, and he was not the only performer involved. The dozos to whom he sang, in addition to the women who accompanied him, sang his refrains, performed as well, ultimately by hunting. In response to his words, they were supposed to go out into the forest that night and kill game and give it to the family of the deceased hunter. Placing an animal's carcass at Drummond's feet, you see some of the hindquarters, which always went to the Dozo singer in a basket here the morning after a Dozo funeral in the village of Yamaso, confirmed a Dozo's identity, just as surely as reading or listening to the recitation of the Quran confirmed a Dozo's Muslim identity. At Dozo funerals, Dozos moved and acted in ways that intextualized Drummond's words and the hunt that they were imagining, the hunt that Drummond was trying to provoke them to perform in the forest that night. Dozos danced throughout the night in response to his words in a counterclockwise circle, taking their feet, sort of shuffling in a sort of step, touch movement at the speed of walking, as if searching for game in the forest. Drummond kept the rhythm, playing an iron rasp. I have one of those rasps here called a quinquenien, the sound of which resembles the hissing of the dry grass that clogs the forest of this part of the world in the dry season, and through which hunters have to walk until they eventually just burn it all. This is what that sounds like. And when dozos are dancing this slower dance throughout the night, that's the speed at which they're dancing. And I want to play you a clip, though, of what this grass sounds as dozos are walking through it. This grass can grow during the rainy season up to 10 feet tall, as you can see. And in the beginning of the dry season, dozos just burn it. The burning doesn't burn the trees down. The trees are pretty resilient, but it clears the grass so that dozos can hunt better at the end of the rainy season. Near the end of Drummond's songs, he accelerated the rhythm and dozos would burst into a rapid dance as if in hot pursuit of game. And I want to play you a video of that now. You'll see dozos dancing slowly in the foreground in this ambulatory rhythm counterclockwise, and groups of say 2 to 5 dozos will break away and they will lift their legs up, hold their guns high. The expressions on their faces change to being quite aggressive, starting to perform the hunt that ideally they will then take into the forest that night. I'm looking for the cue here. Here we go. So you can see them going counterclockwise here, breaking off. It's shadowy in the back. There are a couple breaking off with their guns held high. Drummond is right here in the back with his apprentices away from the dozos, drawing them forth, as it were, to put their dozo role into effect on display for everybody to see in the service of encouraging this deceased dozo, his spirit, to move on to the afterlife. So Drummond's songs, let me get rid of that slide for a moment. Drummond's songs depended then on these physical performances as much as his words to push dozos to hunt. And his harp elicited all three simultaneously. Without his harp, he wouldn't sing the words. Without his words, dozos wouldn't dance. Without the dance, dozos would not go into the forest to hunt. So for Drummond, the combination of these three kinds of performance made dozo funerals analogous to Muslim scripture. Text and embodied action were of a piece. Such ideas would have raised the eyebrows of scholars of literacy like Walter Ong and Jack Goody, who have argued that writing has a permanence that orality lacks. They argue that non-literate people lack the potentially more refined capacity, the most subtle forms of critical thinking, since oral texts are ostensibly transient and leave no material trace. Writing, in contrast, is more or less permanent, producing documents that concretize thought so that authors and readers can critically return to them later to contemplate and criticize their own ideas. Ong and Goody denied orality the full potential to intextualize the way writing does. Drummond defended that potential. The material aspects of his performances were crucial in this respect. Ruth Finnegan has highlighted the multimodality of African texts in orality. And I want to say that Drummond put those on display. And I think I'm actually coming to the end of my time. So I'm just going to go ahead to give you a sense of how Drummond's songs sounded as he was singing. Let me see which slide that is. I think that's right here. So as Drummond would sing, hunters would blow their hunting whistles, which they would use to signal their presence to other dozos while they're in the forest hunting, so they wouldn't potentially shoot each other, or to call for help. You'll also hear dozos' voices praising Drummond's words. You'll hear the harp. You will hear women clapping in the background. You'll hear a volley of black powder shot from a dozo's musket. And you'll also hear that rasp, that iron rasp I was playing earlier. So there's Drummond singing. Dozo whistle. And you can hear the harp in the background. You can hear dozos praising Drummond's words. There's Drummond singing again. They really like what he's singing. There are women clapping. And there's a volley of black powder. And there's the king. And so what I want to argue is that together, dozos and the women listening to them were performing the material and moral connections that they aimed to reestablish after the death of the dozo who once embodied them. Drummond provided, and other dozos then were providing the non-dozos in the dead man's compound with game meat. And knowing that living dozos would be looking after his family enabled the deceased to move on to the afterlife. So dozo action depended intimately on Drummond's words for its accomplishment. Dozo songs were correspondingly embodied productions, not just oral ones. They were multimodal, and not surprisingly, dozo singers also motivated dozos and other rebels in their struggle against the Ivorian state from 2002 to 2007. So just to conclude then, to me, this sort of performance and this sort of perspective is so important because I'm working, as David said so well, at the boundary of indigenous African ritual and Islam, a boundary that many reformist Muslims want to deny to the disadvantage of Muslims like dozos who stand and want to continue to stand astride it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Fantastic, Joseph. All right, so once again, just to remind folks, please keep your questions coming. We only have a couple, but you're welcome to start typing them. I will organize them and ask them of the speakers at the end of the three talks. So now I'd like to introduce Panayotis League. Panayotis League is Assistant Professor of Musicology at Florida State University's College of Music and Director of the Center for Music of the Americas. He's the author of the monograph Echoes of the Great Catastrophe, Resounding Anatolian Greekness in Diaspora, published just this year by University of Michigan Press. Congratulations, Panayotis. He's also the author of many book chapters and articles. An active performer, composer, and recording artist, Professor League plays fiddles, lutes, accordion, percussion, and zambuna, which is the goatskin bagpipe, at venues around the world. In 2019, he was named a master artist by the Florida Folklife Program for his work performing and teaching the traditional music and oral poetry of Kalymnos in the Greek immigrant community of Tarpon Springs, Florida. Professor League specializes in the traditional music of northeastern Brazil, Ireland, and especially the Greek islands and their diasporas. His new monograph traces pathways of repertoire and style over generations of Anatolian Greeks, in particular those, that is to say, those expelled from Turkey following the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, and their descendants, back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, investigating the ways that their musical traditions contributed to their understanding of their place in the global Greek diaspora and the wider post-Ottoman world. Professor League also studies the Cretan ballads that narrate the events of the Nazi occupation of Greece and the subsequent civil war, using centuries-old musical and poetic techniques. Furthermore, he studies the singers of these ballads and the efforts of the researcher and collector James A. Notopoulos to repatriate the recordings to the singers' descendants. And that's what we'll be hearing about today. Professor League's presentation is titled Archival Impressions, Cretan Songs of Crisis and Resistance from the James A. Notopoulos Collection. Thank you, Panayotis.
Thank you, Professor Romanchuk, and to my colleagues, Professors Elmer and Hellweg, and to all of you for participating in this seminar. Two wonderful, enlightening, and very thought-provoking presentations, and I hope to continue in that vein to some degree. So let me share my screen. Everyone see that? Great. So as Professor Romanchuk said, I'll be talking about some songs that were recorded by James A. Notopoulos in the early 1950s on the island of Crete, the big island to the south of the Greek mainland, more or less halfway between Athens and the north coast of the African continent. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, I'm relieved that Professor Elmer spoke before me because he covered a lot of ground already. So a lot of what I'm going to say is very analogous to what he was talking about, Perry and Lord. So James Notopoulos, I had known about Notopoulos's fieldwork in Greece for a very long time, frankly, before I even went to college, because a lot of the musicians who I grew up around in Greece and in the Greek diaspora, when we would be talking about this particular period of Greek music history, the period after the Greek Civil War, which was in the late 1940s, there were all these legendary names, all these musicians and musical styles that everyone knew about, but there were really very, very few audio or video recordings of them. And the ones that did exist were relatively poor quality. But everyone knew that there was this Greek-American guy who had spent a year in Greece traveling around and making hundreds of audio recordings, and that they were stashed away somewhere at Harvard University. And when I wound up starting my doctoral studies at Harvard and meeting Professor Elmer, one of the first things that we talked about was what happened to all this stuff. And to make a long story hopefully short, Professor Elmer and I and a few other colleagues were able to get funding to digitize and catalog all of these recordings, many of which had also been deposited, copies of which had already been deposited by Notopoulos or perhaps by his widow in the Library of Congress and in a few places in Greece, but for various administrative and other reasons, those recordings were largely inaccessible to researchers. So this presentation, I suppose, first of all, and perhaps most importantly, is to just let everyone out there know that as of really not that long ago, Professor Elmer could say exactly when it went live, but all of these recordings are now available to be streamed on the Millman Perry collection website. And it's really an extraordinary project that a lot of people spent a lot of time working on, and I'm absolutely delighted that now these remarkable treasures are available for anyone to listen to. So that's the door of room C in Widener Library, where I've spent a lot of time Not as much time as Professor Elmer, but a lot of time working on this stuff. And this is James A. Notopoulos. He was born in 1905 in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He was the child of immigrants from Tegea in the southern Peloponnese, the southern peninsula of Greece. And he wound up studying at Oxford, wound up getting a job as professor of classics at Trinity College in Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut. And sometime in the 1940s, I believe, he was a visiting scholar at Harvard, where he spent a lot of time with Albert Lord and was heavily influenced by his work, by Perry's work, and by that general question that that Professor Elmer was talking about, and decided to do an analogous study in Greece, looking for contemporary Greek manifestations of these poetic techniques, these epic techniques in particular, in order to do his own work of scholarship. He was also a Homerist, published a bunch of articles, but he really wanted to write a book, which he never finished. He died of cancer, I believe, as you can see in his early 60s, was never able to complete this project. But luckily, not only all of his recordings were safely housed at Widener Library in Harvard, but also all of his field notes. And so there's a lot of work that remains to be done, including actually a couple of different handwritten versions of his manuscript. But what I'm going to talk about today is some of the recordings that he made on the island of Crete, particularly ones whose subject matter is the Nazi occupation during World War II, and which used all of the mechanics, all of the traditional melodic, poetic materials of both modern Greek epic song and folk song to narrate these events. So this is actually a copy of the letter that he sent to, I believe, the Guggenheim Foundation, from which he got a grant after his field trip, just his report. And as you can see from this slide, he recorded 645 discrete performances between the beginning of his grant, which was in August 1952, and the end of his grant time, the beginning of June 1953. Although actually, the recordings only began in earnest late in December of 52, and the vast majority of them happened in the spring of 53 for a couple of reasons. One, his recording equipment, which he bought with the money given to him by Guggenheim and also the American Philosophical Association. The recording equipment was stuck in Greek customs for about 6 months, or 5 or 6 months, so he couldn't even begin recording until he got it out. And also the weather was very bad in the winter. His son, who Professor Elmer and I have met in Boston, who accompanied him on these trips, told us that he also had a very, very steep learning curve, learning how to work the equipment, because in his son's word, he could barely make a piece of toast with a toaster. And he didn't even touch the television. He was really an old school, as his son used to say, as his son says, a 19th century type of guy. So it took him a little while to learn how to use the recording equipment. And you can tell that from the earlier recordings are not really expertly done. But by the end, when the weather was good, when he was able to travel around, the recordings are pretty remarkable, and especially the recordings from Crete, which we're going to focus on. Those were from May 1953. So what he did was he got this equipment. He rented a car and bought a donkey for the places where the car couldn't go. He had a gasoline-powered generator to power it was a Westcorp tape machine, I believe. And he just took to the mountains and villages and of the country, traveled all over. And as we can see, 645 selections he recorded. So 149 of these were traditional heroic oral poems, which is what he was mostly interested in. 63 of them were songs and short epic poems on events of the Second World War. We are going to focus on that category. And the majority were non-heroic folk songs, dances, instrumental music, folk tales, and Byzantine church music. To most scholars of traditional Greek music and most musicians, that last category is the most interesting and an incredible treasure trove of beautiful performances and very high quality recordings of musicians, a lot of whom we know only from a handful of commercial recordings or just tales about them. So it's very exciting. But until now, until the work that Professor Elmer and all of our colleagues at Harvard have done, until that work came to fruition, the vast majority of this music was just unheard and unknown. And in fact, there were only 3 Notopoulos, together with Folkways recordings, which now belongs to the Smithsonian Institution, put out 3 LPs of selections from his field recordings, but that's it. Pretty much everything else, the other, I think if I looked on my iTunes, I would see, but it's about the other 118 hours or something of music nobody's really heard it until now. So it's very exciting. All right, so we're gonna focus, like I said, on some of the material from Crete, May 1953, that narrates events of the Second World War, the Nazi occupation. And we're gonna look at this, and we're gonna look at the mechanics of the recycling of music and poetry, or what I like to call it, the Greek Aegean melody language interface. Right, this is really what it is. We're going to look at how the mechanics of this work out in 3 different categories of songs. The first one is mandinades, which are rhyming couplets in iambic decapentameter. So if you imagine everything, a lot of Emily Dickinson's poems plus 1 syllable. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. That's the first half of a mandinada. A real mandinada in Greek, let's see if I can just pull one out of my head right now. Χίλια καλώς ευρίσκαμε και πάλι να βρεθούμε του χρόνου τούτο τον καιρό να ξανανταμωθούμε. It's 1,000 times auspicious that we're here today, and I hope that next year at this time we'll be together again, something like that. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 categories of poetry that uses these different melodies that were already in circulation, and that these poets used this material that they already knew from their daily lives, and they matched broad themes that were already present in extant songs or extant manifestations of the language melody interface to narrate what they had just experienced. And I make that distinction between songs and manifestations of the language melody interface for this reason. In the Greek folk song tradition, folk music tradition, there are songs, narrative songs that generally we know what the song is about. Of course, it changes in every performance, as we all know. But you can say we're going to sing the song of so-and-so, the song of Xexenis, or the song of Votsaris, or the song of some historical figure. We know the story. There's a particular melody in let's say we're all from a particular village on Crete. We know that we're always going to sing this song to this particular melody. We know the contours, but the singer is going to be recomposing in performance. Those are songs. Then we have melodies that in the moment of performance, the singer will put linguistic content to. Will either improvise or pull out of the common stock couplets largely that fit the contours of the particular melody. And I won't go into the endlessly, to me, fascinating details of how singers negotiate this in the moment, because it's very, very rarely in this tradition, if you're going to sing a couplet, do you just sing the whole thing from beginning to end? Every particular melody chops up the syntax of the language in very particular ways. So for example, I might sing the first 5 syllables of my couplet, of my first line, and then repeat syllables 3 through 5, and then sing syllables 1 through 8, and that kind of thing. We're not going to get into that. Okay, so the first category, like I said, is rhyming couplets and iambic decapentameter set to dance melodies. Notopoulos recorded a lot of these, and I will just sing you very briefly this example. This is from the village of I believe in Sfakia, which is in the western part of Crete. These are some men and boys who, well, he recorded these men, all of which were veterans of the resistance against the Nazis. This fellow right here was probably 10 or 12 years old at the time that he was fighting in the mountains with his elder brothers and father and uncle. So an example of this would be a Cretan Sirtos dance. And the melody I believe that they sang this to went like this. Klenetas fachanavuna, klechopsiloritis, Yadash kotosani germaniti levendiati kritis. This kind of thing, right? So, and this exchange of mandinaves, in the traditional context, singers would go back and forth. In this particular recording, the members of this little group of friends and family sing 7 or 8 mandinaves on this theme back and forth to each other. So that's fairly straightforward. That's what we're used to in the Greek island tradition. You have dance music, a dance melody, people just improvise or recompose, we should say, lyrics that fit in the moment. But things get more interesting when we start to look at couplets in non-rhyming iambic decapentameter, that's a typo, sorry about that, set to other types of melodies, which are vehicles for songs called rizitika. The word rizitika refers to the word rizes, the roots of the mountains of Sfakia, which basically means the highland country, the hill country, before the mountains really start to climb. And these in general are heroic songs. Generally speaking, they are, like I said, non-rhyming iambic decapentameter. Usually there are only 2 or 3 couplets, sometimes only a couplet and a half, and they always end with a half line. So we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of these type of songs. Most of them narrate historical events from Cretan history. A lot of them narrate episodes from the most famous Byzantine epic, the Genisa Kritas, where the hero is battling various Saracens and other enemies and death himself, recycling a lot of imagery from ancient Greek epic, of course. So right now, I want to play for you 2 examples of variations on a rizitiko melody, in which in its most popular form begins with the line, Phoni και κλάμαν άκουσα στα Λυκιανούς στον κάμπο. I heard weeping on the plain of Alikianos. So that's the second example on this slide. Now, the traditional song, which is probably a few hundred years old, refers to a battle between Cretan rebels and Ottoman forces outside of this village, Alikianos, in the 18th century. So this song, this is one of the most, so the point is that if you're from this region and you hear this melody, it immediately brings all of these associations, emotional associations, intellectual associations with this specific historical event, this tragedy where, from the local perspective, Cretan freedom fighters were resisting the Ottoman occupier, and they were all slaughtered at this area by this river in the plain of Alikianos near a bridge. So here are two examples that Notopoulos recorded of a group of singers from the village of Kasteli Kisamu in the western part of Crete, singing two variations on that song to the same melody. One about Hitler, as you can say, Hitler, don't boast that you subdued Crete. You found her unarmed as her children were away. That song actually, most Greeks know this because it was recorded. What we're going to be hearing the voice of the composer, to speak of this version, singing, Yoros Koutsourellis. Later, he taught it to a very famous Cretan singer, Nikos Xylouris, who made it very popular in the 1970s all over the country. And then we're going to hear the more traditional, let's say, version, Phonike Klaman Akusas Talikianus Gambo, which refers to a battle against the Nazis where they ambushed a large group of Cretan guerrilla fighters and killed them by that same, or not the same bridge, but the site where the bridge, where the battle with the Ottomans had happened a few hundred years before. And just for the sake of comparison, here are four other versions, four other variations on that theme, that general theme, sung to that same melody, that recorded by Notopoulos. There are several, but here are just four others. You can see the first two are almost exactly the same syntactically. They're just switching out nouns. I heard weeping at the hill of Galatas. I heard weeping down on the plain of Aya. And then two others, which are variations on a slightly less common Rizitiko song that uses the same melody that refers to another battle with the Ottomans. Varitu feki richnite, in two other places, Kandanos and Achladas. Kandanos, for those of you who know World War II history, is the village in Crete that was obliterated by the Nazis to set an example against the Greeks, to show them what would happen if they resisted. The famous saying was that the order from Hitler was to leave not a single stone standing, and the entire village was wiped out and rebuilt, of course. So the last category that we'll talk about is narrative songs using mandinades, which of course are the rhyming couplets in iambic decapentameter. The word, incidentally, mandinada, of course, is from the Italian or Venetian word mattina. Mandinada, something that you sing in the morning, not because you got up early and went for a jog and did your vocal exercises, but because the sun is coming up, you've been carousing all night, and you're standing under a girl's window, singing to her and dodging the flower pots or the water that her father is throwing at you from up above. So these songs are quite interesting. because they are marked because of the melodic material that they use. They are marked as special and unusual and out of the ordinary. And what I mean by that is they use melodies that are associated neither with dance music, neither with the rizitiko tradition, which you hear as a Cretan and you immediately know we're talking about historical events. This is a solemn moment that traditionally is celebrated at the drinking table, but rather these melodies that these songs use are they're metrical melodies in meters, musical meters, dance meters, that are common, that are dance meters in other parts of the Balkans, for example, in Serbia and Albania and Bulgaria, 5, 7, 9 beat patterns, but which are not danced on Crete or in the Greek islands. These type of rhythms are reserved for paraliturgical music. In other words, songs that use folk poetry, rhyming couplets, but that are dedicated to saints. For example, telling the story of St. George on St. George's Day, or on the occasion of the Dormition of the Virgin Mary, August 15th, singing a song about the life of the Virgin Mary, that kind of thing. So when you, just like as a listener, a culturally conditioned listener, when you hear the rizitiko melody, you know that we're going to be singing this song that's going to reference this battle against the Ottomans. When you hear one of these melodies, you know that you are going to be singing a song about something very sacred and perhaps something very, very heavy. So I have a couple of examples of that. Here's one that is about the destruction of the village of Anoia by the Nazis. And this is sung in this recording by a 12-year-old boy who I was hoping that he was still alive when I went there a few summers ago to start repatriating these recordings, but he had died a few years ago, so I wasn't able to find him. But I did speak to his relatives, and as a matter of fact, through a connection, a family connection of somebody who knows the mayor of Anoia, I was able to get him this recording, and they played it at the annual memorial ceremony for the people who had died fighting the Nazis. And I was able to be there, and it was quite a moving moment, as you can imagine, because later on in this song, this 12-year-old boy who's singing this mentions by name many of the people who died, both fighting the Nazis, but particularly the women, children, and old and elderly people who were murdered, who were in the firing squads. So here's this song.
Lulu Yamina Dizete Puglia Migela Iditeta no Yamase Capsane Natali Pidite Najiria Chiti Dahini Ora Puliturgu Sibi Castano Ya Yermanitsa da Destesi Tusi Andate sa devricane cavane to coma ierusce ine copeda cato takamanola.
So again, these melodies for a lot of people, a lot of these melodies are explicitly associated with martyrdom. That's perhaps the best way to understand it. Remember, lives of saints, right? So this particular melody, I think in the Anoia area, I can't remember which local martyr it's associated with, but you get the connection. We won't listen to these, but this is another example of one of these songs. And what's amazing about this, and this gets into the final point that I'm going to make, that Notopoulos's recordings are very, very useful to us because he made sure that he recorded the same singers singing the same songs several times. Sometimes right after, in a row, 1, 2, 3, sometimes one this day, one the next day, sometimes with a week or two of distance. And so if we compare them, we can see really this process of composition and recomposition and performance at work when we note differences. And so these are just two examples. So the bold-faced text is the part that the singer changes, and then the English translations in these two different colors. This is a narration about the Battle of Maleme, which was the battle for control of the big airport in Western Crete at the very beginning of the Nazi occupation. I'll just give you a second to look at that. Of course, what's terribly interesting is the presence of the New Zealanders and the Maori soldiers, who were a played a major role in the defense of Crete and in the thwarting of, or rather the delaying of Hitler's schedule. So, okay, so we'll move on. And this perhaps is my favorite example. The abduction of General Crepe. So towards the end of the war, Hitler replaced the commander of Crete with General Klepe, Heinrich Klepe, I believe, who was about to retire. He was not a very enthusiastic Nazi. He kind of went along with it. I think the impression I've gotten is that he was hoping that he would not be stationed somewhere and he would just get to live out his retirement and the war would end and he could just go and putter around the garden. But for whatever reason, Hitler decided to send him to be in charge of Crete. Some Cretan rebels kidnapped him, and this was an operation that was led by Patrick Leigh Fermor, the British spy, an amazing fellow. To make a long story short, it was a rather dramatic kidnapping, but it was largely symbolic. The war was basically over at that point. Klepe really had very little authority in the Nazi command structure. His men were not particularly loyal to him, and he was not necessarily a bloodthirsty. He was a Nazi, but he wasn't really involved in any major combat operations or anything like that. But that, to the oral poet, is not terribly important. What's important is that these brave Cretans captured a Nazi general. So you can see in this excerpt all of the tropes of heroic poetry. Well, maybe not all of them. In the actual song itself, which lasts about 45 minutes in the Notopoulos recording, you can see all of them. But here you see how everything is blown to the most dramatic proportions, where this is the action, this is the brave action that ended the war, that saved Greece, that saved humanity. And Crepe is elevated to the status of Hitler's right-hand man. Nature itself both puts the heroes through trials, and then in the form of the sea, and of course in the form of death, personified Charos, and also congratulates them when they finally arrive in Cairo, the sun celebrating the end of the war, and this kind of thing. So here's that singer.
Μάρθεν η ώρα της στιγμής, μάρθεν η ώρα της στιγμής, για να ξεκινήσει κι ο πυβουλός, ο στρατηγός, την Κρήτη να αποχαιρετήσεις. Έβαλα τον στο υποβρύχιο κι η θάλασσα που σκόνη κι ο ουρανός εμάνιζε κι ο χάρος του μαλώνει. Στο Κάιρο ευγήκανε μέρα λαμπρά μεγάλη και ήλιος το αχτίνες αχτινόσκοπου χρυσάφι βρεχτυπούνε πως πόλεμος σταμάτησε και δεν θα ξαναδούνε γιατί έπιαστηκε ο εμπιστότερος του Χίτλερ το τσανάκι τον πόλεμον ο Χίτλερ τώρα θέλει να το χάσει.
I particularly love this because Hitler is given a Greek name, O Hitleris, instead of O Hitler. And this, interestingly enough, is sung to the melody of the Erotokritos, the great Venetian Cretan epic romance that, again, all Cretan people know. All right, so winding up, I'll just like to give you a few brief anecdotes from my own fieldwork a few years ago and quote Dimitris Papanikolaou in his article, Archive Trouble, riffing on Derrida's Archive Fever. And I'll quote, archive trouble is the effort to reconstitute the archival at a moment of crisis. an effort that more often than not becomes evident through the emergence of embodied acts, of bodies that show anxiety, show affective attachment and emotional release, show the explosive potential of a present experience and the need for embodied counter-memory and radical understanding. Now, Papa Nicolaou here is talking about the new queer theater and cinema movement in Greece, but I think what he's talking about, I think his points resonate quite sympathetically with the experiences that I had playing these recordings for people. So a few years ago, the summer of, God, it feels like, yeah, it's because of COVID, it's been a very long time, 2018, I think. I put about 3,000 kilometers on my rental car and just crisscrossing Western Crete, going to all the villages that Notopoulos made recordings in and giving copies of these recordings to local musicians, to the descendants of the people who recorded, to the local folk music clubs and so forth. I found two people who were still alive, who Notopoulos had recorded, and I will just introduce them very briefly. This is Adonis Kalamarachis, Kalamar Andonis, as they call him, was born in 1915, in 1916, I believe, 17. We'll see. Anyway, he was 37 years old in 1953, so I guess that makes 1916. When Notopoulos came to his village, so he's from Kandanos, that village that the Nazis had completely leveled. So the villagers rebuilt it, and he was 37 years old in 53 when Notopoulos came to record him and his group of friends, which included his best man. The two of them were the lead singers, and then his brother and two other neighbors. So I found him. He was 102 years old at the time. We took him to the office of the president of the local folklore society, and we played him. It was a great scene. I remember somebody asked him, "Uncle, which ear can you hear out of?" And he pointed to this one. So we put his ear right next to the speaker, and we played the recording, and he immediately knew what it was. And he started telling us, he said, "Oh my God, this is the recording that myself and my best friend and my brother and the other guys made when that American with the funny accent and the powder blue suit came, and he found us, we were shearing a sheep, and he insisted he wanted us to come down to the coffee house or something and record us, and we really didn't want to go, but we did it. And myself and my best friend left after 2 songs, but he kept recording them. And I think I remember the songs that he recorded, and he told us the whole story, and then he started to sing along. And so this is a video of him listening to himself and all of his best friends and his brother, all of whom are now deceased and had been for 20 or 30 years at the time. Right after that, he told us that it's really a shame that he and his best friend, who were the lead singers, left after 2 songs, because when he heard for the first time the other 3 songs that the other guys had sung, he was really embarrassed. He said, "Oh, my brother never sings that right. After we're done, I'm going to go down to the coffee house after lunch, and I'm going to light into him tell him he needs to practice and he needs to listen to me, because he's going to embarrass us in front of all these Americans who are coming to," and then he remembered that his brother had been dead for a few decades, and it was a very emotional moment. And then finally, Kyria Amalia Katachi, who I found after much searching. She, as you can tell, is much younger. She was 9 or 10 years old, I believe, when Notopoulos recorded her. He came to record her mother, who sang some songs about World War I. But then he recorded her singing a lullaby. And this was a very emotional experience because apparently, according to her, Notopoulos and his wife were very impressed with her. She was going to school at the time, which was very unusual, and read and wrote Greek very well. And they actually were in conversations with her parents to sponsor her, for her to come to America and get an education. But her father decided not to let her go. So that hearing her mother and hearing herself sing was a very emotional experience for her. So here's her singing, listening to herself sing this lullaby on my tinny laptop speakers.
Μέγαλωσα ψηλό βουνό, πυκνώσακι Παρίσι. Να ποιος είναι η κλόνη του, σαν Ανατολή και Δύση. Έλα ύπνε και πάρε το, αφού δεν έχω άλλο. Μη είναι και πιο μικρότερο, μη είναι και πιο μεγάλο.
Apologies, she was a teenager, as you can hear from her voice there, but no less emotional. So wrapping up then, I hope that this gives us a little bit more context from a different, a third cultural zone, a third place and time, to think about all of these same themes and techniques and larger just human experiences that both of my colleagues were discussing earlier. So thank you very much. And just, I just have to say, Adonis Kalamarakis, who we heard first, just died a few weeks ago. So just say, in memory of him, 105 years old. I was really hoping to get to have another cup of coffee with him next summer when I get to go back to Greece, but alas, it's not to be. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Panayotis, and Vichna Pamit. So let us, if no one is opposed, okay, we do have about 7 questions, but if I may take an organizer's privilege and ask you some of my questions first, and hopefully this will also keep those who ask the questions sticking around a little bit longer in order to hear their own questions answered. So I have a question for each of you, although everyone can possibly jump into any of the question or to any answer. But if you don't mind, I'll just give all of my questions all at once, perhaps a little confusingly. So David, I very much like the idea of border philology, and particularly you made a very convincing case focusing on the Albanian Bosniak songs, that we have a kind of shared world of singing here, right? In terms of the shared vocabulary, the shared meters, the shared heroes, the shared topics. But I did want to bring up a paradox that Victor Friedman identified in his afterword to the volume of Balkan Epic. What he notes is that as distinct from prose genres, or oral prose genres in the Balkans, the epic doesn't seem to know code switching. That is to say, the use of another language to characterize a character's speech. Let's say the use of a Turkish language in a Turkish character's speech in a Slavic form. Again, Friedman points out that this is found in the folk prose, but it's never found in folk epic. And this, I do have one possible counterexample, but I would like to hear if you have either any examples, counterexamples, any just thoughts on this problem of the absence of code switching. In other words, what Friedman claims is that the epic for all of its the shared features of the epic across the Balkans, it doesn't create a shared world. This is his claim. All right. Then for Joseph, I was fascinated by the singing and performance at the Dozo funeral. In particular, that is the notion of putting the shadow of the hunter to sleep, as it were, to rest, right? Consoling the spirit of this hunter, and indeed these these figures, these Dozo hunters are, as you point out, not just hunters. They're shamans. They are healers. A theory was put forth. It's been put forth by more than one, but in particular based on the work of Roman Jakobson and Filaret Kolesa on Slavic epic and lament in general, and then Kolesa on Ukrainian epic and lament in particular. If I'm not mistaken, it was articulated as sort of a question by Natalie Kononenko in her book on Ukrainian minstrels, and she wonders if one could consider the epic to be a male lament for the dead. That is to say, this notion, it's probably been articulated in different contexts as well, but I simply know it in her work as, again, that if Jakobson shows that ultimately, in Slavic at least, the epic and the lament grow out of the same form. The question is, can we think of the epic as a male lament? That is to say, a song that's meant to help the dead on their way, in particular the warrior dead. And then for Panayotis, again, just absolutely wonderful material, and it's always very moving in various ways, moving in the sort of the purely affective way that when we experience these singers hearing themselves or their relatives so many years later, but also in terms of this epochal fight against Nazism. And I was wondering about the notion of the warrior singer, which is often dismissed in the literature. So, for example, it's been argued that theories of warrior singers are sort of romantic nonsense, and that that in fact, at least in the Slavic context, that with perhaps some exceptions, like the exception of Serbian singers at the time of the first uprising, etc. But that we're actually dealing with songs that are mostly created, transmitted by non-fighters, by non-warriors. But your examples, and indeed, if we consider what the Dozo Hunters morphed into, right, which was essentially a military force or a paramilitary force, we're also here in Joseph's context dealing with warrior singers, and so perhaps might it be possible to rehabilitate the notion of the warrior singer, or the possible connection of the origin of epic with warriors, which again, at least in my field, has long been dismissed as romanticism. So those are the three questions. Anyone can jump in, and then I promise we'll get to the audience's questions immediately after. But any responses to these questions?
I've had the most time to think about a response, so maybe I'll just jump in first. Yeah, thanks for reminding me about Victor Friedman's contribution there. I guess I would say, you know, it all depends on how we define the codes, how we delimit the codes, how we draw the boundaries between them, whether we're going to say that there's no code switching, at least in the Balkan texts I've been talking about. There are certainly examples of the description of or reference to code switching. You know, the hero who travels to a Turkish household and greets those there in Turkish, even though it's a Christian Slav who's there, and you know, maybe the Turkish itself isn't quoted, but it's referred to. And by the same token, you know, there are plenty of examples of the use by Slav singers of Albanian terms like besa, which is this sworn word, promise, or feast, which means clan. Of course, those words may be more part of a kind of local dialect where you have the populations in contact, and therefore these words enter into common use. But another kind of example of you spoke about no shared world. I mean, there are also plenty of more ethnographic descriptions of instances in which a Christian singer will perform a song about Muslim heroes because there are distinguished Muslim guests in the audience, and there is an effort here to kind of speak to a person who in one configuration might be thought of as an outsider to the community. So I would just say I'll have to go back and reread Victor's take on this, but a lot depends on how we delimit the codes, and I personally feel that there is in fact a lot more. I'm not sure I would call it code switching, but a lot more kind of intermingling of worlds that can be observed here. So I'll leave it there.
The epic exists in a shared world, and it partakes of a shared world, even if it doesn't perhaps represent a shared world in the way that Friedman would.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess one of my big points was that in this kind of Balkan context, there is so much historically, so much migration and intermingling and contact. That it is just a shared world. To have code switching means to feel the presence of this of a harder boundary than I think actually exists in a lot of these contexts.
Fantastic. Yeah, good point. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the question, Robert. And I'm thinking, first of all, I wanted to say something more precisely than I did. I didn't have time to, and I'd meant to. One thing that's really important to understand about these songs is they're cyclical. One performance leads to another, which I think is why Bauman and Briggs' notion of contextualization is so interesting here. Mm-hmm. When Drummond sings, he provokes dozos to hunt. When dozos hunt, he'll then sing about them later, and he'll recall, especially after they've died too, their exploits as hunters. So I didn't get to play this brief clip, but let me try to do that now. It's Drummond singing at a dozo funeral about another dozo who had died. This is not the dozo he's singing about. He doesn't actually sing epics. He once spoke an epic, which I recorded, but this is sort of the kind of thing he'll sing about a dozo. So he did a lot of things, this dozo. He killed 99 elephants. How can you do this? Where is he now? Ubi sunt, if you will. So it is, these funerals are laments for not just the dozo who has died, but previous dozos whose lives stand as exemplars for the ones who were standing around and not going out into the forest that night to hunt. And so the purpose is to publicly shame them so that they feel like they're not real dozos, so that they'll go and vindicate themselves. And he sings a lament to women, only to women. And as I recall, I don't think there's any clapping. I don't think dozos respond. It's the most somber moment of the entire night. And these funerals last from after dinner at about 8 p.m. until sunrise, or even before sunrise, and the first Muslim prayer of the day. And that lament goes something like this. There isn't a lot of text. It's basically a refrain. Nanyu mani we dozo biena dozo barikat nanyu mani. I'm not singing it terribly well, but and then he'll repeat this and he'll add another phrase. So dozo barika means thank you, dozos, and he'll sing the refrain again. Nanyu mani we dozo biena kalanjan sara nanyu mani, and then he'll insert the name of the dozo, like Karanjan, who has died, Asara. And so there is a refrain, but in this case, it's not an epic. And I wanted to say too, at the beginning, you mentioned that Manding oral poetry, maybe the center of it is northern Côte d'Ivoire, and I would actually displace that center to Guinea and Mali, and talk about the epic of Sonjara or Sunjata. And the author of the first prose version of that, Jibril Tamsir Nyan, just died recently. But the man that epic centers on, the first emperor of the state of Mali, that goes back to about the 13th century, Sunjata Keita was himself one of these dozos. So I hope I've answered that question, that I don't think that in this case, the epics that I know of in the Manding speaking world are actually laments per se. The laments that happen at Dozo funerals are not just are laments of dead men, but they are designed to end the sorrow, so that dozos will go out and hunt, and then recapitulate this cycle of hunting, which gives life, and then eventually those dozos will die again. They will have funerals. Other dozos will hunt. So it's kind of double-edged sword. There's a lamentable side of it, but there's also this life-giving side.
I see, and that's absent in the lament proper. The life-giving side is which in other words, in the praise song or whatever the song is that we're singing to provoke the hunt. That's where we find this cyclic, the sort of cyclic feature, and that might be absent in the lament proper. You're suggesting?
Yes, and that's what amounts to intextualization. That's what gives these quote unquote oral texts this sort of material armature, the performative nature of it, the musical side, the dance, and so on. It's what enables the memory of those funerals to persevere from one context to another, and actually gives them a kind of life beyond just this sort of ostensibly temporary oral performance.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Panayotis.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I don't really know. I mean, to your larger theoretical question, I mean, there's not really much I can say, I don't think. But just in terms of the specific ethnographic context, I can say in Crete in particular, much more so than anywhere else in Greece, and very differently from, I think, cultural standards in rural mainland Greece. Masculinity, manhood, is very much associated with violence, or with at least the ever-present threat of violence and the ability to marshal violence for specific reasons, right? From stealing sheep to defending your family to, of course, the long tradition. I mean, the Cretan psyche is so, if I may say something like this, is so saturated, especially a couple generations ago when these practices were still very, very widespread. Sure. It's so saturated. The Cretan psyche and the Cretan identity is so saturated with the ideal of freedom or death, or like the refusal to capitulate, the legacy, reinforcement through songs, through folk tales, through everyday life of the history of resistance to foreign occupation, which meant Arabs, Venetians, Crusaders, well, not exactly Crusaders, but associated people, the Ottomans, of course, and then the Nazis and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, masculinity is very much associated with being a fighter, being a warrior, training, always making sure you're in shape to be a warrior just in case. And singing, particularly the Rizitika songs, the ones, that second category where the context is a big group of men feasting and drinking wine, sitting at a very big table. Men who are shepherds, for the most part. This is a mountain tradition, right? Men who always carry guns and big knives with them. and who sing most of the songs are about battle, right? So I mean, there's a direct association, not just like not just in the local kind of world, you know, microcosm, not a theoretical association, but a direct lived experience association between these two practices, between these two aspects of what it means to be a man.
Sure. Yeah, and your emphasis on violence and the presence of violence, that's very well taken too, because certainly it's going to be different from place to place, as you say, even within Greece, right? Mainly Greece versus Crete, and yet that's what these songs are about ultimately. Is about masculinity that is ultimately defined around violence. Okay. Well, thanks for humoring me. Now I'd like to ask some questions. First of all, from the very first person to ask a question was Jordan Sigas, asking first of all about the South Slavic epics. So that's for David. A little more about the context of South Slavic epics. Are they attached to a culture of dance or other types of performance? If you could just give a few words about this, please, David.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so they're first of all part of a broader ecology that certainly includes a dance and other types of instrumental performance. But the epics themselves are not performed to be danced to. It's really a performance that it's typically men who gather in the audience and listen to these long performances. And you know, the most the performance context, let me put it this way, the richest tradition in terms of like the length and complexity of the songs is really the Muslim tradition. And there, the most important probably performance context is the gatherings of men during the month of Ramadan, when they break their fast and spend long evenings together. And it's this context with lots of time to sit and listen to performance that generates these really long and elaborate epics.
Whereas in to turn really briefly to Panayotis, in the Greek context, and as far as I understand, this is Pan-Hellenic. The epic having let us say devolved isn't the right word, but having sort of reformed itself as a tradition which is closer to a ballad tradition, at least is what Lord and Beaton claim. We actually do have dance contexts for songs that, again, either were epic or we might still consider them to be epic. That's correct, yes?
Well, I guess, or maybe songs that that narrate episodes from what we can think of as epics,
yeah.
But just for practical purposes. I mean, they tend to be shorter because
sure.
But I mean, in the tradition I grew up around, for example, from the island of Kalymnos, a lot of the most beloved dance songs are narrations from lives of heroes, particularly Revolutionary War heroes, so from the 1820s, for example, that are just short little episodes, like when the guy is captured and they're taking him to the gallows and his mother is crying, or something like that. But the things that I would think of as really following, that we could think of as epic or mini epics, are generally not.
I see.
They can be in dance meters, as I said, but they're generally not danced to. Gotcha. Because in the dance context, all over in the Pan-Hellenic context, the priority is always maximum involvement. So everything about the music, dance, and poetry that's being sung is about getting everybody involved. Whether dancing, singing back what the main singer is singing, obviously being a musician, or just being part of the thing that's happening in the festive occasion. And epic, the type of epic song that, for example, Notopoulos recorded is not really conducive to that. It's performance.
I see.
Which is, and actually, it's a good way of thinking about this. I think it's one of the exceptions in the traditional, like, rural Greek context. It's one of the exceptions to the rule of always being about maximum participation.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you. Fantastic. So let me mark this one as answered live. Next, a question from one of my students, Nate Lanigan. Joseph, to you. He was asking a very nice material question, which I appreciated. More about their arms. Do the Dozo Hunters use specific rifles? Do they specialize in black powder single shot rifles, or do they hunt with whatever is available?
Right, great question. I really appreciate that. And I think it also speaks to this issue of intextualization. And I want to evoke Jacques Derrida's notion of arche writing here eventually. I mean, you see this Dozo whose back is turned to us, and this is in one of those fast dances when Drummond has removed himself from this counterclockwise dance circle, which is still going on. This is a rifle that probably this Dozo managed to get from an expat. There were a lot of expats in Ojene at the time running an onchocerciasis project. There were helicopters headquartered in Ojene that flew throughout the region of Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Côte d'Ivoire, southern Mali, and into Burkina Faso to eradicate onchocerciasis. And many of those men who were flying the helicopters would hunt. And so they would bring with them rifles from Portugal or Italy or the US or Canada, or wherever they came from. So there you see that sort of rifle, a 12 gauge, I should say, 12 gauge shotgun, not a rifle per se. But you also see this young Dozo holding a locally manufactured gun. And these guns were muskets. You can see one right here. In fact, if you look closely enough, you can see the flintlock. So they were guns that we would think of as archaic or antique, the kinds that soldiers would have used in the American Revolution. But in fact, they are very easy to make locally. Ironsmiths, Numu in Manding, make them all the time. One explained to me that often they would use the steering columns of old wrecked cars as the barrel. Yes, thank you. The barrel of the gun. And those kinds of muskets make a very sonorous boom. I mean, you could hear it on the recording. A 12 gauge shotgun or a rifle would not do that. And so it would not be interesting. So it both evokes the past, it reflects the self-sufficient autonomous nature of local manufacturing, that Dozos can manufacture their own rifles or have ironsmiths who do. And to me, this is the kind of material inscription that Jacques Derrida has in mind with this concept of arche writing, in which he says that, you know, the West has now monopolized the concept of literacy. What is literacy? It's either, you know, alphabetical or ideographic writing, whereas there are all sorts of examples before the colonial era of associations between embodied or material forms of inscription, say the repeated lines of dancing by Dozos, these sonorous booms of black powder. And I don't want to just be purely figurative about this. Drummond had told me of a place where ancient men had inscribed their actions on a mountainside. And in 2015, I went to the village of Tindiriman Sokoro, and some local young men took me and one of my research colleagues, Drissa Kone, from the area up to the face of this mountain. And they pointed to us to these inscriptions, these depressions on the volcanic face of the mountain, where they had said that an ancient man had prayed, and Jomande, one of our guides, then commenced to do rakaz, praying as a Muslim, right on that spot. He also pointed to this stain on the mountain face, which he said was left by the urination of the Muslim's horse who had driven up to the top of this mountain to pray. And then even more interesting to me was that he took us to this boulder and he showed us these indentations. And he said that two other ancient men had met there and inscribed an oath and they were so tall and powerful that their fingernails left the impressions. So to me, there is a historical sense also that our contemporary notion of literacy is not the only version that there is. And a Dozo hunter said to me that that wasn't writing, he said, but it did what writing does. In other words, it left a material inscribed trace of an oath that two men had made for themselves. So to me, what Drummond's practice and that whole claiming of his harp as the hunter's Quran, this quote unquote oral genre, he was comparing it and analogizing it to writing. It seems to me there is sort of an indigenous, autochthonous conception of literacy that corresponds more to Jacques Derrida's than to this usual juxtaposition we have between the literate and the oral. So thank you very much for the question.
I think that indeed it as a not just embodied, as we've been talking about, as sort of embedded discourse, it's much more accurate and much more attractive when one is thinking about precisely the kind of singing and performance that you're discussing, to also think in terms of what is considered writing. But of course, you also noticed you noted the importance of the word, which would bring us back to the Balkan singer, right, and the riech, and this, of course, to go back to Foley's How to Read an Oral Poem, right? His chapters are organized as words, right, as these riechi, which is again, it's an attractive gesture. It seems to be the right way to talk about and think about this stuff. David, one from Ronald Alexander for you. Thank you for a great talk. You've shown successfully that strict adherence to two instances of categorization, namely Vuk's men's versus women's songs and Cholakovic's traditional versus post-traditional, do not correspond to a much more nuanced reality. Vuk realized this by admitting that some songs were, quote, on the border between the two, and Lord eventually admitted the existence of epics that were on the border between orality and literacy. How do you apply this concept to the idea of traditional versus post-traditional? Is it possible to identify songs that exist on such a border? And if so, how do we go about it? My sense is that what Professor Alexander is inquiring about is perhaps might you nuance your 2010 article on Cholakovic, perhaps to think more in terms of perhaps of borderline phenomena, or in fact you already did that in your spoken remarks today. Perhaps you could just expand on those a little bit.
Yeah, well, thanks to Professor Alexander for the question. She knows I'm a great admirer of hers. It's a good question, and I think in a way the answer is adumbrated in Lord's essay on the transitional text, where one of the things he talks about is the way in which a traditional poet, singer, might compose a song, a totally new song on an untraditional topic. And given the fact that the content is in a way so untraditional, he suggested that there might be cases in which such a song could not be learned by another singer unless that other singer memorized it, which is really not a traditional way of acquiring material in this tradition. So I think that might be an example, such a song, and Lord refers to one actually produced by Philip Vishnich, one of Vuk's very important informants. I think that might be what we might think of if we talk about kind of the something on the border between traditional and, if you like, post traditional. And the test would really be, can it be acquired by in the traditional manner by someone else? Now, I would still insist that for all of their exceptional qualities, a traditional singer listening to Avdo Medjedovic would be able to acquire the story in the traditional manner and perform his own version of the story, which would likely be far less elaborate and elaborated than Mljedevich's version. But I'm not prepared to see there, something that is in any real sense on the border between traditional and post-traditional, if that makes sense. So I hope Ronell likes that answer. It's certainly something worth thinking about further.
Yeah. Well, it seems that again in your oral comments, you locate this border elsewhere, right? Not that is say that we're speaking of tradition, but the border is not between tradition and post-tradition, but it's in another place. Yes.
Well, I mean, I think there are various ways to define, where the break is between tradition and something else. But I don't think the bar is met, at least in the case of Avdo Mljedevich, where really the very fact that he can sit there and sing for hours on end is proof to my mind that he's relying on an entirely traditional technique. So.
Indeed. Thanks. All righty. Let's see. Well, these things are moving around. All right. For Joseph, my questions are popping around. From Peggy Wright Cleveland here at FSU. I'm invigorated by the fuller idea of orality that you offer, extending the embodied voice to include embodied movement or dance. This puts literacy at a disadvantage to me, less capable of such full expression. It seems in West Africa that literacy and orality have long been at odds. Do you see any ways literacy attempts to support, replicate, or put forth the multiple components of orality? And perhaps what Peggy has in mind is literacy of, again, if you'd be willing to entertain, of a non-Derridian sort. In other words, perhaps where the Western imposed literacy. Because of course you're talking about this arca writing, right? Which in some sense takes the place of literacy for these communities. But it seems to me that her question is focused on perhaps Western style literacy. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting her question. But again, do you see any ways literacy attempts to support, replicate, or put forth the multiple components that you're speaking of?
Well, thank you, Peggy, for the question. Of course, Peggy has lived in Côte d'Ivoire, so she knows something of these performance contexts. And I would actually say that the history does show otherwise, that you do have this very long tradition of, or history of Arabic scholarship in West Africa, the most renowned center of which would have been Timbuktu in contemporary Mali, which attracted, of course, Muslim Islamic students from all over the Muslim world, or the Islamic world. And I'm thinking of a figure, a Marabout, an Islamic scholar by the name of Al-Hajj Salim Soare, who was a 15th century figure who argued for a much more tolerant form of Islam. Not to say that the standard was intolerance. His point was that Muslims living in West Africa at the time, in the 15th century, were very much not the majority. It was a very small minority, mostly of leaders, merchants, and scholars in urban areas like Timbuktu and other such centers. There were these small pockets of the Dar al-Islam in the larger Dar al-Kufr, the land of unbelief. And he counseled Muslims to be quite open and conciliatory to non-Muslims in the area. And you can see this today, I think, in Dozo's participation in Islam. And I just want to go back to a slide of Jaman Coulibaly. The shirts that Dozo singers wear are covered in amulets, which either have actual inscriptions from the Quran of Quranic verses, or they may have kinds of what they call sacred squares, which are these numerological representations of Quranic verses, which amount to repeating the verse multiple, perhaps thousands of times, so that it's protective. Drummond would claim that jealous dozos would potentially throw spells at him while he was singing to trip him up so that he would forget what he would try to remember. So you see here a man who neither reads nor writes French or Arabic, whose French is very rudimentary. He speaks various versions of Manding. So he is quote unquote non-literate, yet his body is surrounded by writing, because writing is seen as having this power that inheres in the very material inscription of the words, not necessarily in the meaning per se, but of course Arabic is God's language in Islam. So the very material presence of Quranic verses on his body protects him. And a scholar of Islam in West Africa, whose name is for some reason escaping me, unfortunately, has written that Soninke clerics like Salim Soare use this practice of amulet making to extend the presence of Islam among non-literate West African populations up until Islam became more widespread, and madrasas, we probably normally think of them as, call them madrasas, Quranic schools, could implant themselves, and there could be a greater understanding of literate Islam, so that even non-Muslims who recognized the power and status of Islam could in some sense participate in the Islamic world without reading, writing, or speaking a word of Arabic. So
fantastic. There's your support. Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. And I also have to apologize for again associating carelessly this notion of the kind of literacy of which Ong is opposing to orality with the West, as I did in my rephrasing of Peggy's question. I obviously still have a lot of Eurocentrism to shed, as probably many of us do. But thank you. It's a great, really very interesting. Let's see. For Panayotis, for you from Jordan Sigas again, your experiences with these epics, ballads, and songs in the Greek diaspora. Do you experience these types of oral traditions in communities like Tarpon Springs?
Okay, great. Thank you, Jordan. So for those of you who don't know, Tarpon Springs is a small town on the Gulf Coast of Florida. It's maybe, I don't know, 25, 30 miles north of Tampa. It's where I more or less grew up. And it's one of the strange places, unusual places in the Greek American context anyway. Well, really in the Greek diaspora in general, in that it's a rather small town that since the first Greeks showed up has been majority Greek was until maybe the 1980s or something like that. My family immigrated there to participate in the sponge industry, the sea sponges, diving for sea sponges. That's why all these Greeks are there. I think when my mom was growing up there, it probably had a population of 9,000 people, and probably maybe 10, and 7,000 of them were probably Greek or of Greek extraction. So anyway, in a word, well, it takes more than a word. In a sentence, like this stuff is pretty rare. I mean, the kind of stuff that we're talking about now, Notopoulos was recording the last generation of people who could do, in terms of epic stuff, who could sit down and sing an epic for extended periods of time. Absolutely the very last generation. And most of those people he was recording were quite old. The ones who were singing the actual, what I'm thinking of as epics, like the one about the Nazi general, right? Where this person sings for 45 minutes. I mean, that kind of thing. The last people who were, as far as I know, or any researchers know, the last people who were capable of that died in the 1950s or 60s. So that kind of thing, absolutely not. That has been gone for a long time in Greece, and absolutely in the diaspora, it's been gone for a long time. What is still very strong in some places throughout the diaspora is extemporaneous trading, recomposition and performance of couplets, of rhyming couplets, the mandinaves. And unsurprisingly, the places in the diaspora where it is strong are in communities from the places in Greece where it's still strong, which are really the island of Crete, the island of Karpathos, the island of Kalymnos, to lesser degrees, the island of Kefalonia on the western, in the Ionian Sea. That's actually where my family is from. We call them rhymnes, rhymes, right? And then a few other islands in the Dodecanese, Leros, Kos, Chalki, to a lesser extent Rhodes, but not. I mean, it's pretty rare even today. In places like, for example, in Tarpon Springs, which is a very Kalymnian, from the island of Kalymnos tradition, even though people don't recompose the narrative songs, right? The ones that tell little episodes of epics, a lot of people know them, and they're still a part of daily life. They're still a part of dance music, you know, at weddings or at parties or things like that. There are a lot of paraliturgical songs that are still popular. For example, the Lament, there's a very famous Kalimnian version of the Virgin Mary's Lament for the Crucified Christ, which is in Kalimnos, is sung after the Holy Thursday church service, liturgy, where everybody stays and they sing this very long song. The whole thing takes about an hour and a half, I think, of couplets that from the perspective of the Virgin Mary lamenting her son. But even in Kalim, I mean, Tarpon Springs, we do it there, but most people don't know it by heart. And because it's a group thing, everybody has to sing the same words. And so the parish, you know, at the beginning of the church service, they circulate a printout of the lyrics. I think I might have sent it to you, Robert, but I can't remember.
I do recall that, yeah,
Yeah. But even in Kalimnos, if you go and you look on, you know, on YouTube, like, you know, the local TV station always records the whole thing. And half the people there are reading it off a piece of paper too, because everybody, you know, it's the world we live in now. So to summarize, epic stuff, not so much, but in island communities, especially Dodecanese and Cretan communities in America, in Europe, to a lesser degree in Europe, I would say, even though it's closer to Greece, and in Australia, people are still conversant in extemporaneous couplets.
The Montanades tradition, yeah.
What's that?
The Montanades, yes.
Yeah, Montanades, yes, very much, but that's pretty much where it ends in terms of being extemporaneous, in terms of things changing all the time.
Gotcha. Now let's see. We are running a little late, but and one of my students asked a question, but it's a pretty big question, and so if you don't mind, I'll ask him to email you guys about this question. I will ask the one last question from the very patient Angelina Ilieva for David. Do we have access to the emic categorization of the songs that Vuk called women's and men's heroic, roughly ballad and epic? It's a good question. And then a sort of follow-up question: would Avdo have sung the Hasanaginitsa, for example, Hasanaginitsa, for example?
Yeah, great question. I don't know if Angelina is still with us, but hopefully she can tune into the recording.
She could watch the video when it's
to
up
get
there.
her answer. Great question. So Vuk, at least in the footnote that I had showed in my presentation, actually claims that this is what we would call an emic designation. Ženske pjesme. He says that's proper Serbian for this kind of song.
Although he invented proper Serbian.
Right, but he's the inventor of proper Serbian, so you know. I think that probably the real emic kind of system of classification would be much more narrowly focused. So informants might talk about songs tied to specific occasions, tužbalica in term for laments, for example, or they might speak about singing to the gusle or gusle songs when they were talking about what we would consider epic songs. So I think probably if we could go back and talk to Vuk's informants, we'd end up with a much finer grained kind of set of categories. The question about the Hasanaginitsa, no, Avdo would not have sung that. It's interesting. Vuk tried to track down this tradition, this song, in sort of living tradition, and he was never able to actually find it among singers. And it turns out he was probably asking the wrong people. He was asking guslars, men who sang to the gusle. There's a very interesting, on my bibliography, you'll find a book just called Hasanaginitsa, which has a sort of collection of articles on this. And it turns out that in the 1930s, the famous Croatian sculptor Ivan Meštrović told an ethnographer, hey, I know a version of the Hasanaginitsa that I learned from my grandmother. And it turns out that most likely this is in fact a women's tradition in Dalmatia. So it was not part of the typical men's repertoire, even there where where Fortius found it. So that's a great question. Thank you.
All righty. Well, it is 5:30. This seems like a good time to once again extend my sincere thanks to everyone involved, to the audience, to our wonderful panelists, to our wonderful support at the Winthrop-King Institute, to Rasha and to Dave Sale, to everyone who helped make this happen. And yeah, well, as Panayotis wished, may we all meet again next year and learn more from one another again. All right. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. This has been wonderful. A great way for me to end this semester. I hope that that you folks have had a good time too.
Thanks everybody. I really learned a lot from everyone here and from the audience as well.
Yeah, great meeting everyone.
Yeah, great. And to my colleagues, Robert, Joseph, and David, thank you very much. It's an honor to be associated with you all in this way. And I hope, David, you can at some point get yourself down to Tallahassee so that we can.
I'm ready.
We can do
as soon as I get that shot in my arm, I'm ready.
I know. So we can do that in person, and we can toast to all these marvelous artists who have inspired us so much.
Absolutely. The next time you're snowed in up there,
Right.
we'll get you a ticket down there.
I'm dying to leave, believe me.
All right. Thanks again,
Thank
everybody.
you, everyone.
Absolutely,
everybody.
everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much, Robert.
Bye.